this month for Families Forward, we have Grant is back to give us some updates and then have a conversation this evening. So I'm really looking forward to that. I don't have any updates this month. Look at that. We will be pausing Families Forward as always for the summer months, and we'll be back in September. So watch your email and see when we're starting back up, third Thursday of September, and see what exciting things we have happening then. But without further ado, I'm going to welcome Grant to speak to us this evening.
So I guess I'm back by some kind of not really popular man. And who was here last time I was here? Because I recognized Fred there. Right, so some of the group. And I guess the feedback I got through Bobby, through those of you who were here last time we visited, you felt like there was some purpose to this. Yes. And I'm trying to build off of that purpose. And I'm hoping everyone's kind of comfortable with that. Because sometimes I start off in a direction I don't quite know what's going to happen, but I'm okay with just trying it out. Most of my background, and I think I've shared pieces and parts of that last time, is actually with children and in the children world, but I've spent just as much time in the adult world. And you know, both teach me lots and lots of things about how to live and how to do. One of the things I've learned to be is very patient. And very open to possibilities and just let things kind of unfold the way they're going to unfold, as opposed to kind of pushing things along. And Bobby and Betty and Brooke and certainly my group here, we've been rethinking how we have consultations with families. And sometimes we have really direct, concrete business, but sometimes we just want to talk something out or share something about a direction or an overall direction. And we kind of want to borrow from experiences. And we're not quite there yet, I don't think, like in terms of what that might look like if we're going to try to do something more concrete. But I'm just trying to stir the pot a little bit, collectively get us all thinking, because I don't think what I'm pursuing is really the same as something we've done in the past. You know, so sometimes I think just like Bobby and Betty do when you come together in Families Forward, they've got really clear updates, right? Just informational things to kind of put out there. In my world, BJ's been a part of that with our regional parent advisory group. She's trying to hide in the back because there's a camera going on over there. Yes, we've always had a mix and match with our regional parent advisory group, where we had really specific content kinds of things that we were sharing, like updates about numbers of families served or whatever it might be, like just some very data, right? Like here's where we're at, versus discussion items. Yeah, and I don't think we're set up tonight for really discussion, but you know, the last time I was here as well, it's pretty open-ended. So I kind of share where we seem to be at, where we're thinking about going. If you have thoughts, impressions, by all means, jump in and just share something. And we'll just kind of tie it together as we kind of keep going. I don't know, Wolfgang was here last time, but maybe I'll let Wolfgang, Carmen, and BJ kind of introduce themselves and who they are from our area of the world.
Can I jump in just really quickly? Because I did forget to mention, we have been broadcasting Families Forward live on Facebook a little bit. So we're doing that again this evening. So when Grant mentioned there was filming going on, I saw some people look at me. The audience is not being filmed. So you will not be on camera, just Grant.
I watch CNN a lot. This is not a secretary, I hope. Anyway, sorry, Wolfgang, why don't you go ahead.
Hi, I'm Wolfgang Otto, and I'm a supervisor on the transition team with Disability Services. So I've mentioned before, my team works with youth and young adults who are both in FSCD and PDD. Yeah, I'm one of the two supervisors on that team.
Hello, I'm Carmen Roberts-Kolchak. I'm a supervisor with the adult team, so we deal with the adults sort of the 23 and up in their lifespan, and I am also one of two supervisors on that team, currently one of one. Yeah.
And I'm BJ Boussier, and I'm a caseworker in the 0 to 13 child and family team. And as Oksana said, she's known me for over 3 decades. That makes me a legend. And I can sit in the back.
And I actually having BJ, I'll just call it B just for everybody's okay, because BJ and I have known each other quite a long time. Adding the child and family component to these conversations is a direction. I think some of you have heard either through the grapevine and some of you who are near. I'm just going to do a real quick check. How many of you are with PDD side of our supports? And is everybody FMS? Almost everybody FMS? And some of you are a mix and match, right? You've got your FMS supports and then you have some agency supports, right? So that's one of the things I'm hoping, I hope everybody's comfortable with that. We're hoping this is a bit of a venue to just share, like how we're thinking about things, what seems to fit, what doesn't fit. Also, you know, hoping to tap your experience. Because, I mean, all of you here, you've had a journey. You know that there are younger families coming in behind you. And if we can learn something to kind of create a path or a pathway that somehow makes their lives somewhat less challenging, and we actually have some control over that, that would be a hope. The other piece is if there's something in what we do and how we do our business together, we can make some adjustments that are within our control that makes your lives somewhat more successful, more positive, however you want to frame that for yourselves, because you'll find out I've got lots of words. I could use them lots of different ways. Yeah, that would just be a common shared goal, would it not? Like when we talk about well-being of families and well-being of individuals, whether a child, youth, adult, I hope that's just something we have in common. And I have this genuine hope that just through shared conversations and open conversations, we can actually come up with some ideas that might lead to some solutions that are just meaningful, right, for everybody who's involved. And I think we've kind of alluded to this in the past a little bit. Like we also know we don't have all the solutions, right? Like sometimes it is about persistence, and sometimes it is about patience with each other or with your individual, with your spouse, with the agency you're working with your caregivers, right? Like, and most of you, especially as parents of adults with disability, right, which is really this entire group, correct? You've lived a lot of that patience, and I would suggest quite well. Because I've lived the other side as well, where I've watched families be quite distressed and quite troubled and experience quite significant problems. And I'm not dismissing anybody's life here, but you know, obviously you've had some degree of being able to work through challenges and really what are quite challenging circumstances at times yourselves. So, you know, if you're okay with that, I'll just use that as kind of starting point. Is that all right? Okay, good. And yeah, and I'm okay with the fact that sometimes some of what we might talk about gets pretty personal. You know, might get to that place for some of you because I like to share stories. I like to hear stories. I think Bobby did a really good job of this last time, where just the only kind of caution is that we're not really here to negotiate your services, your individual services supports. We're here to just talk about the life of disability and life with disability, and some of the things that we're doing to try to be more responsive or set ourselves up to be more successful with you. That's really what we're here for. Is that okay? Okay. Did I get it? We came here with just a real general agenda, so they're like, sure, Grant. So good. Okay. So what I'm going to start you guys off with, and I really wish some of our regional parent advisory ethnicity group had come, because we had Deborah Hoekster here last time, and I'm hoping to pull in Sherwin Prochnow and Kellyanne Lothrop and some of that group. Because one of the things that I'm going to blame Charlene for is she's got me started off on thinking about something, and it was about getting families off to a good start. And one of the things, now that I've lived with our PDD side or adult side for a year, really formally a year, it's 2 years. And as I mentioned, I came out of community agency almost 10 and 10, 20 years in community agency, 10 in the, really the children's services side, and 10 years on the adult side of support. So kind of walk both sides of the road. One of the things that Charlene really spoke to really strongly and clearly with me one time at a regional parent advisory was this idea of a strategic approach to trying to get families off to a good start. In FSC world, the average family comes to us when the child's 3 to 8 years of age. That's just how our families come. Right now, I think we're just over 4,000 open files in FSC side. We just did some checking the other day, actually, like when it comes to sharing numbers. And we've had a little bit of a change. It used to be, and it's still true, the vast majority of our families come to us in that age range. But we've got a new kind of cohort of families coming to us 9 to 12. In fact, we even check, well, what do they look like in terms of their child's disability? And they look exactly the same as our 3 to 8-year-old kids. It's still about 1 of every 3 of those kids have a diagnosis of autism, global developmental delay, cerebral palsy, those kinds of things. And it's about 20% of our total cases are children with just mental health concerns, no intellectual disability. So they really look really quite similar as children based on a profile and how we look at that in our system. And maybe it's about population growth.
Is that foreign?
You know, because we can't ask, we can't put that in as information in our system. We don't actually know. We know Edmonton is probably becoming one of the richest in terms of cultural diversity communities maybe in Canada, like Toronto used to be, Vancouver of course, but I'm willing to bet you Edmonton, if we look at Census Canada data, is quickly becoming one of the more diverse communities in Canada. And I honestly, I don't know what that's about, because one of the things we were going through just a few years ago is, which was a change, is a lot of the young families coming to us, almost all of them were children born here number. So we're getting this kind of, they've moved here for jobs, they're young couples, young families, and they're having young children. What a shock. So that would have started about 4 to 8 years ago, versus when I first came to FSC 11 years ago, probably 1 in every 4 families who were coming to us had just moved to the province. Well, BJ lives the intakes. I don't, you can always just correct me because you actually see the cases. But this is what I'm hearing through Nancy and Britta at intake. So something's changing in our FSC world, mostly because of population growth, who our families are, and also one of the things that happens at intake is for FSC is families come to us and then they go away. They show up at our doorstep, they get some information, they go, well, I actually don't need you right now. And then they leave us. And then one of the things that might be contributing is as their child gets older, and now they're 8 to 10 years of age, and I'm going to use autism, if you guys are okay with that, it's just a lived example because I lived that a lot in my world, is now they can see the challenges that their child has in relation to their peers, and now they're looking for some kind of help. Because that is one of our lived experiences, that regardless of diagnosis, there are programs out there called PUF, and a lot of our early school year programs are quite strong, and so a lot of our kids with disabilities actually do quite well with their families, with pretty limited support from us. So for the number of families who actually show up at our doorstep, as many just kind of, yeah, it's nice to meet you, and we'll go. So how many of those families now are returnee families who had some initial information versus they're brand new to us? We've probably got to figure that out over this next year or so and look into that a little bit more closely. But there's a real change. I call them points of entry. Oh, I need a pen. I talk about them as points of entry. So our point of entry in child and family, if I had numbers up here, used to be mostly around in here, right? So if this is 0, and around here is 18, right in the middle. Most of our families are coming to us right here. Well, now they're coming in early school years, puff age kind of thing, and now they're starting to come in those middle school years, and I haven't even gotten to know what's going on with PDD, because that's changing as we stand here tonight, as we live it. So one of the things that Charlene got me off as an idea was this idea of getting off to a good start. Well, Wolfgang, I've been spending a lot of time on transitions. 2 years now?
Yeah, it's true.
It's been about 2 years. Because Ethicity, in our wisdom, decided that transitions was a really important thing. Not a shock, I know, for everyone in the room, but they decided to actually, my division counterparts decided to actually write policy that spoke to that. I think it was about 3 years ago. Was it not? You remember, somewhere in there, right? That we formalized it as policy. And it was thinking about that range, but then we started to try to figure it out, dig down. What does that mean in case practice about 2 years ago? So this is all pretty recent stuff in terms of trying to work through transitions in a really, really intentional way, and actually supported by policy, which for most of you probably, thanks very much for catching up. That's, because we know that's government, right? Anyway, we're usually a few steps behind in terms of how to think about this stuff. So anyway, what's also happening when I talk about point of entry is we've got a lot more families coming to us, 17 to 19. David's not here tonight, but David represents some of that story. I kind of miss him tonight because he's just a good story to kind of connect on. But living lives with older youth moving into young adult who's not going to be in a school program, who has a life history of neurodevelopmental disability. I'll just use autism again as an example, but FAS, attention deficit, Tourette's. There's a little bit of a list of these really common diagnoses that we see as a condition that's impacting that youth's life. And guess what? They're not quite ready to not be in a school program or to live with that kind of structure on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And of course, as parents, quite concerned about, okay, what does life look like for Jimmy, Jane, after their finished school years? And even as we stand here, like education is trying to make some adjustments to address some of that need to support youth. So they're stretching their kind of involvement mandate, but I know my education colleagues work quite closely together on lots of this thinking. Is, well, an educational program to do what is sometimes the question they're asking, because really you're talking about life skills, community living skills, pre-employment and employment skills. And while they can do some really good work with that, sometimes it's about just getting out there and doing some of that, which PDD over the years, I think most of us would agree with that work. That's kind of what PDD has done for individuals with intellectual disability. So there's quite a few folks kind of looking at PDD these days for either some leadership or some guidance or some involvement with what we would have called just a couple of years ago unmet needs, which means that that particular young person does not have a diagnosis of intellectual disability as we know it, as we understand it in legislation, as we define it under developmental disability. And that's a major challenge for, well, really all of us who are in the disability services side. And it's work that we're doing really closely with Gateway and all of our counterparts to try to find what does response look like. Just coming back to the Child and Family Life Group for just a second, one of the things that's quite different in ethnicity world is our involvement with families, believe it or not, is the mode is 3 to 5 years. For some of us who are involved with Brenda Lee, and well, you know who Brenda Lee is? Yeah. So our ADM and kind of our lead on aligning ethnicity and PDD at a ministry level, at a program level. one of the things, and I remember this meeting really clear, it was August 2014, and we're out at Wellman. It was a little bit of a retreat. And some of my adult colleagues didn't really know the child and family side of the world. They'd lived their entire careers or their work in adult disability. Now, one of the things I was pretty clear about, not all our families stay from the time their child walks through the door with their mom and dad, a lot of times it's moms, and ask for our involvement and our help. And they don't stay with us until they're 18. In fact, if I showed you the bell curves, which I can send you the graphs actually, the visuals, one of those things that kind of post, is our average involvement with families is 3 to 5 years. Quite a number of families are only involved with us 2 years. So coming back to children with autism, they get the supports that they need as families. Their child starts to do quite well. Those are the positive stories. And the family in our world perceives as FC specialized services, this thing, big category is called developmental support. So we have this range of interventions that we assist families with. And we work with our school colleagues and our health colleagues on that all the time. But we provide this service called specialized services. It's really important to families with children with autism. Their child makes progress, starts to do quite well in terms of routines and participating in routines, going to school, getting up, getting their day started, those kinds of things. And families say, guess what? I think that's all I need for help right now. And off they go. And so for ethnicity, and I have some really great data that Maria pulled for me just in the last few weeks, that just really represents that really clearly. We're not in families' lives from 0 to 18 or from the time they walk through the door to the time they leave. Many of our families, the nature of disability, that's not true for you as families, I'm guessing, but for many of our families in the FSA side of our disability services program, their need for involvement from us is for a time and then that's it. And now because I live both sides, we're starting to see families coming back when their youth is 17, 18, 19, and they're going, okay, now we've got a plan for Jimmy, who did really well through that 3 to 8-year-old phase, and now Jimmy's 17, and something different has to happen for him. So I don't know that that was Brenda Lee's plan, but we are starting to live kind of this life cycle, life stage with some of our families in a way that, you know, the theory would hope that's how things come to pass, but now we're starting to live it more directly. And there are certainly a number of strengths to our being in the same office to kind of work on these things, to share information and work through some of those challenges. So in the child and family life side, that's where we kind of got started, or at least I got started on this idea of getting off to a good start. It's trying to help families get the information they need, we call that family support, to be able to navigate systems. This is the stuff that Betty and Bobby and Wolfgang and some of us have been swapping notes on left, center, and right, is this idea of helping our families get information about who's out there, what do they do, how do they do what they do, and how can they be of best support to you, and off we kind of go. And you can appreciate for young families how important. The next piece, and we've just been playing with this lately, and I'm going to blame BJ for that, is just help with childcare. Right? This idea of respite and having caregivers in your lives with you, helping you just provide care and address care. We know when you move into adult world, especially for you, all of you as FMS families, that's really a critical aspect of your lives with your individuals. Now, as we kind of move up, or move down, whichever way you want to go, because I'm going up, this idea of getting off to a good start, and I was alluding to that, it starts to look a bit different. So now as we're dealing with our 16, 17, 18-year-olds, we're talking about pre-employment, employment readiness. What does that look like? For some individuals, of course, really you're talking about community access, meaningful activity in an employment-like setting or whatever that might be. For other individuals, yeah, you know what, they're just not ready to walk out of that school and do what they need to do in job training or those kinds of things. There's something about some repetition or the speed of that training, whatever needs to happen for them, that needs to be adjusted in a way so that they can have their best success. And that's part of the world I came from when I was working in community. Part of our services and the area I was the most involved with were our SIL services, outreach services. And we were working with individuals who were quite independent in some things. And we spent a lot of time working with Goodwills and the Chrysalises and that whole group to try to just support individuals to be as independent as they could. But I was also quite involved in the group care and family-based care area of that work. And a lot of the same things kind of came up. So 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, not ready to be independently employed, needing some kind of adult support to be successful with that. What can that look like? And how can we move forward on that? Income. I don't know if this is true for everyone in this room, but of course, from a lot of our kids as they turn 18, medications, healthcare costs, all those kinds of things are just ongoing parts of their lives. And the idea that AISH or some kind of income support needs to be in place as they turn 18 to deal with just some of those ongoing needs that needs to be planned for. And I don't know if I'm getting current this bit, but it feels like we're getting better at that. If it's a case, and we worked on this a number of years back, Louise is going to speak to this history. Bobby might know it better than I do, or Betty. But we started trying to work collaboratively with AISH, well, a long time ago, really. But I have to say, I don't know that we were particularly strong at it, because we were still running into these very program-specific kind of procedural kinds of issues. And so we still had situations, and AISH's biggest problem, and I'm just going to be kind of blunt about it, is the number of Albertans in need of AISH supports is pretty significant. Like, it's a really big number. And so their problem over the last 5 years in particular, and the last 3, last 2, price of oil, jobs, those kinds of things all kicking in. And so their demand for their supports has been really, really significant. But it's say, even with the change in the population growth, those kinds of things, at least as I live it with you guys, it really feels like we're getting more timely involvement from AISH as an income need. And because minimally we can just make phone calls to each other. Not that long ago, just 2 years ago, if we're calling each other, it's no different than you calling them. Same response. Now we just get on the email. We fire each other email. Can you get back to me on this? And we get really quite timely responses. And they still have their things to work through, just like we do. So, you know, things don't happen overnight, but I would say for the most part, if we know the case, if we've been involved with the case, if we're providing services to the family or the individual or whatever we're doing, we're working with the agency, they're working really hard with us to find solutions. And so we're making bits and pieces of progress on this thing that I call these days collaboration and teaming. And so there's some real strength in being kind of aligned as this community and social services with income and Alberta Works and all those kinds of parts and pieces kind of aligned with us to try to respond to some of these needs. I'm just going to pause. Does anybody have a question? Because I'm talking fast and I'm talking a lot. Is it okay? Is it interesting?
It is.
Good.
If you go back to your previous slide, what was below that, I think, where you started, I just really want to, so we're a long ways, we're way out in the adult phase now ourselves, but at least an observation that we have made in the communities that we've been a part of. If that orange arrow gets neglected or is underfunded, we end up with this huge liability because the families burn out, and at 18, they just say, I'm done. And now we go from modest need financially to huge need. And so I see that as a really positive thing that arrow goes out there, and to me it's really lowering our life cost, by keeping that family engaged through that child entering into adult years. Hopefully they can stay engaged.
Yeah.
That's
good point. Yeah, I'm gonna have to invite some of our like Terry Duncan or somebody in because they have just might enjoy some of the stories that some of our specialized services providers share about families, because that's one of the things that I hope, maybe, just jump in, that we've tried to be far more intentional and aware of, right? And so that little triangle that kind of goes down and then it's got this orange thing sitting on the side, I don't know if it's obvious, but the whole thing is a spectrum, right? Nothing is clear.
Yeah, yeah.
There's shades of, things overlap. Nothing is absolutely one thing or the other, but it's always interconnected or overlapping. Now, one of the things that was a really nice model for me several years ago was this thing called pyramid of intervention. And in ethnicity, we talk about pyramid of support. What that kind of tries to acknowledge is this idea that not everybody needs the same thing, but there's kind of different levels of need. But it's, again, the lines aren't black and white. I don't know, Beach, if I'm saying that particularly well, but you know, in assessment systems, like a lot of the formal assessments try to put a category on something. Well, those of us who put this work with clinical professionals, they're the first ones to acknowledge it's not about a box. It just describes. It just tells you a story about something. But until you live that story day to day, you really don't know what it translates into or it means. That's why I kind of miss David. He told that story really well to me one time, you know, some months back. And you know, that's what we try to represent. Like we know that the need of a family versus, you guys have heard this before, is we know your needs as one family versus the needs of your neighbors who are another one of our families can look quite different.
Yes.
What you find is acceptable, what works for you, what helps you be well can look quite different. We do know family life forms patterns. That's why those of you who've done any kind of homework in that area, that's why they write books about this stuff, is that the world of disability, it does form a story that you can capture and represent. But I think one of the strongest stories is that you really have to just be present and let families tell their story and then kind of unfold the pieces from there, because their version of it may look like that, but it's not exactly like that. As one person tells their story versus another versus another versus another. But there's sometimes there's connection or overlap or similarity or sameness, but by the time you add it all up, it's never quite the same. So that child care support piece, as you move into the adult world, that's the part that we're chasing pretty hard. Because I do think that that's probably one of our most powerful learnings, and Carmen, I'm going to pick on her for a second, because she's really highlighted some of our cases or situations that we're living with our families, that as you move from that child and family world into the youth and then young adult world, needs are different. The contextual relationships, what's going to work for you as a family, it's actually quite different work. And I don't think we knew that as clearly as we do today. We might have known it at kind of a theory level, but we didn't know it to the depth that we do today. And so we're trying to make some adjustments as we go along to just align with those learnings as we go. So yeah, Fred, like what's really interesting in this pyramid, if I had really nice, simple things to look at, is some of our families are just ongoing families. They just live with us to 18 and into the adult world and off they go. And what they need for child care support might be fairly significant or it might be fairly mild. But then as they move into the adult world, it shifts, it changes. And so how it's going to be experienced in the adult world looks different, because you no longer have school. And that's just a huge family life difference. Yeah.
You had also said that typically families stay with you to 3 to 5 years. And I would, just from our personal experience, I would say the reason we left FECD was because our son had got to the age of 12. The services we needed weren't really available, and the services we needed weren't funded. So we would definitely fit in the category of having been with FSCD for 3 to 5 years, but then we would have left, from your perspective, we would have left, but it's not because our needs were met necessarily, it's because we, are things just didn't align. So what would be interesting would be to see how many of the families, if other options were offered, would still stay.
Yeah, and it actually, Spring, we really need to have you, maybe what we can do is make a plan. I'm gonna ask Bob and Betty to kind of help us kind of keep track of that. Because if I brought Autism Society here and Center for Autism Services, Alberta, and Terry, they've really adjusted what they do to try to follow life course wise. Now that doesn't mean it's a fit for every family and every circumstance that we live with our families. Cerebral palsy is going to be one of my favorite picks out of that. Is really in our world of supports, system of supports under FSD, I think we've become very nuanced in our supports after the age of 12. The Green Eckert groups, there's social skill things that we're doing. We were not doing 6, 7, and 8. Well, certainly when I came 11 years ago. But I've seen that part. I don't know. If you want, you're too quiet for me. I'm never okay when PJ is quiet. Something's up. No, I'm just kidding. But I don't know if you'd agree, but as we move past the age of 11 in particular, I would say that we have a lot more options in terms of supports that can address some of the needs. Because one thing that used to be our favorite example is at 14 years of age, if you're, I'll use the word intellectually in that neurotypical kind of range, the idea that you want an adult taking you out to the pool, those kinds of things, yeah, no, not so much. And that includes a lot of our kids, right? Is if they're kind of aware of who they are in the world, what's going around them, they start to shift. They want to be with peers, right, and doing peer things. And I do think that some of our service providers have tried to make adjustments. So it's not about them and an adult standing beside them, but about just an activity, something to do. Center for Autism Services and Adaptabilities, Michelle Burnell, are probably one of my favorite, best examples of some of the things that they're trying to do that are not center-based, they're not walking in the building. It's about getting out there and doing things that are hopefully closer to typical. And that every other kind of center group is probably one of the richer in terms of the range of things that they do. Did you want to add anything to that? Or no? Pretty happy being quiet back there?
Yeah, thank you. I'm back actually the first comment that the gentleman made in the front just around childcare supports. Parenting is hard work at the best of times. When you're parenting a child with extraordinary care needs, whether it's mental disability, mental health, combined health issues, that need for respite, to take a break, to catch your breath, to find your feet again. Especially in those early years where there's an expectation that we're with our kids a lot, right? Because everything's so parented, right? Some people have this magic number, you put, I don't know, 20 hours of respite in every unit. But as you know, every kid and every family is unique in terms of that piece of it. So I think that part's really important. I think of the 4,000 families we have within the FSTD side, I bet you close to 3,999 have a respite, whether that's community aid, whether that's...
Yeah, that's 85% of our families at any given time.
So it
some
just
level of
says
respite
that's a big
supports,
piece. And I think that you're right to the lady in front of me in terms of when our kids get to about 11, 12-ish, like when I think of the kids on my caseload, but it's mental disability, mental health, which has blossomed hugely over the last 3 decades. And I have a high immigrant refugee population on my caseload. And so I don't necessarily think that's mental health. It's not all health, it's not all mental disability, but it's another piece of it, right? But there are gaps, there's systemic gaps for kids that get kind of that 12-ish.
Yeah.
Some of it's direct therapy, some of it's art, some of it's music, some of it's animal-assisted therapy, some of it's, like when I'm just trying to think of gaps, like you could probably make a good list, and sometimes there isn't other systems that cover it and fund it. So a lot of times I say to families, use your disability tax credit or your child disability benefit or whatever, right? But One of the biggest one is direct speech therapy.
NOT.
NOT,
Yeah.
right? So we have some behavioral developmental, you're absolutely right, we have some great social skills things, but there's still that little piece that's missing.
So here's what we're doing about that. Because I'll just use cerebral palsy as an example. So with some of our kids, and you talk about early response versus late response, sometimes some of our kids are not ready for the therapies that they receive 3 to 8 years of age. They're just not. And then they start to show us some readiness at 10, 11, 12, 13 years of age. One of the things we're working on with Alberta Health Services, our colleagues there, because they do a lot of the service provision in schools, is trying to figure out that very same issue. And where and when and who's in it, because same thing for them, based on age criteria, kind of clinical business that they carry out, sometimes kids and families are no longer eligible for their services either for this, that, and the other reason. Recently, speech and language is probably our favorite topic. We have kids with some motor speech kinds of problems, which is not uncommon for our families and for our kids with disabilities. They do need some kind of direct speech and language intervention, but we're really clear, we don't actually, you guys have heard this speech before, Sabrina's not here, we don't fund therapy. And by therapy, I mean direct clinical intervention, right? If you're 8 years of age and you've got a clear speech production problem and you need a speech therapist to sit with you, to really work with you and how to guide you through how to use your mouth in a particular way. My speech colleagues can speak to this far clearer than I can. That's not something we actually fund. What we fund is your parent, Monica right there, to be a help to you to be able to use speech in a meaningful way in your life and your day-to-day stuff. That's what we fund. So, you know, when you talk about some of those gaps, the further we kind of go along this, we're starting to see, you know, more subtle areas that we think we can do something with and about. So, you know, unfortunately, Sabrina, I do think that the families coming behind you are probably going to live something different because of the experiences and the time we're spending talking about these very same issues. So you know, again, I can't overcommit to something because, you know, Beej and I have kind of argued about this stuff in the past.
Well, and it's a delicate balance because in those early years of 0 to 13, it's all about building parent capacity, right? It's all about using the strengths you have within your family and the skills and abilities, and you are the child's best teacher, blah, 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 blah. So you build all that. Everything is directed to the parent, right? But when the rubber hits the road, I need an augmentative communication device. Not only do I need that, but I need somebody who knows what to do with it. So it's not just an app on my cell phone. Like, it's not that straightforward. When will I be the boss?
Well, you're the boss of you. When will that be enough? Oh, anyway, so the script is about getting off to a good start.
Yeah.
The subtleties of what that looks like our age and stage approach is actually guiding us a bit. Because exactly where we're starting to, you know, that's such a good point, Sabrina, is this whole piece of depending on where you're at in that age and stage. Again, contextually, some of the way we need to think about it is really the same. You know, just because you've been involved with us for 3 to 5 years doesn't mean you're done. And we know that.
But,
but it's then what fits next. And that we're still running the same issues. There may not be a fit. Yeah.
but I think too, just because someone turns 18, they still need the same supports that they did when they were 16 or when they were 10 or 3.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the supports that they require have changed, but what has changed is there's that missing 6 hours a day when they went to school.
Right.
Now you have to try and fill that.
Yeah.
And where do you go for that? And you go, you know, for PDD, and they're, well, you know, we'll give you some respite. You can have a weekend off a month, and then, you know, that should, you'll be able to survive on that. And it doesn't work because there's not enough activities, there's not enough places for these young adults, you know, 18, 19, 20, they're finished school, where do they go? you know, maybe they can't work.
Yeah.
They, you know, they physically or mentally are not going to work, but they need to have a meaningful day. And that's what we need help with. Like when we're transitioning,
Yeah.
that's what, well, for me, that's what really, where I got stuck was, and still I'm stuck, is filling, like making a meaningful day where you get up in the morning when you used to go to school, and now you get up in the morning and what are you gonna do?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
You know, there's, walk around in the mall with an aide,
Yeah.
you know, they're sitting over here and, you know, and another table over here with people with disabilities, or you see, you know, someone pushing a wheelchair with a man in it to a ladies' clothing store. I don't think so.
Yeah.
That's not what we need.
Sitting in Tim Hortons.
Yeah, Tim Hortons.
Yeah. Yeah, and this idea of, you know, the phrase I use is meaningful activity. What does that look like? Is it meaningful in a way that's meaningful to your son or daughter as an adult now? How does that kind of unfold, and what can we do with it in a different way that does address quality of life and meaningful, in a way that just at least feels good, right? Because that's part of what you're speaking to, Sid, as I'm listening to you, is that the quality of that, fine, someone else is there to keep Jimmy busy or whatever in a sense, but it's not really busy.
Safe. They're kept
Yeah.
safe, and that's,
Yeah.
and sometimes that's as far as it goes. There's not,
Yeah.
and they can still learn, they can still progress, and they can still, maybe it takes them another 5 years to get to the point where, you know, that they're comfortable being out away from school, out in the community and doing things.
Yeah.
You know, but because they're delayed.
Yeah.
It means that they need some time.
Also with talking inclusion, we want to get an inclusion, but not many people out there, they understand disability. They've been sheltered away so much, even when they were in school, that they were separate classroom, they were not inclusive. So a lot of people, they don't know how to deal with the disability, and they're even afraid to deal with them because they never had anything to do with them.
Right.
So it's not, I mean, our son or daughter, whatever, they need help on that community, but they never build up a friendship, they never had a chance to do that. They're just lonely, and their mind is going a mile a minute because they want to do things, but we don't know what to do with them. And I think, what I'm thinking, I know this is off the subject of that, but everything should start, and we should start with the school board at the elementary. That's when they need to get to know the kids about disability
Yeah.
and accept them. This is for the future generation to come.
Yeah.
You know, like,
Well,
they're inclusive, but they don't have any friends. Nobody
Right.
gets their friend, they don't have, I know a lot of cases like that.
yeah.
And that's, you know, if we want the future to come, that they're gonna get accepted the way they are, we need to teach them since they're little to accept them, those kids with disability.
And I think
Right.
what the lady also said, that you're speaking essentially about capacity within systems, in that there's only so many spots, and once those spots are filled, you're talking wait list. And yet, these people can people can live 40, 50 years, but yet there's always new people coming into the system. So that means unless we build capacity to the same degree as people entering the system,
Yeah.
we will simply have a system where everybody behind will be backed up on wait lists, and we won't be able to access services.
Yeah.
And then on top of it, I'll throw in, my son doesn't qualify for PDD, he has autism and bipolar. So we're in that gray zone that you're talking about, where the only thing open to us is H.
Right.
Because we don't, like Chrysalis and all those places are not available to us because of so what I'd like to see the system change is look at what the needs are. Not based it on a number of 70 or 71, but what are the actual needs of the person? So make it person specific, like are they able to do employment? Are they able to do whatever? And then assist them to meet that. Because those hard and fast rules of 70 plus adaptive skills, that leaves a whole chunk of people out that are really kind of left.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's people coming from the other end of it too, because people with disabilities are living longer, so they're coming to PDD for intake, and they're 50 years old
Yeah.
and have lived at home, and you know, and you say, what do you want for lunch? I want lunch. Mom gives me lunch. You know, I've never made a choice between ham and bologna. It was whatever they got. And so those people are coming in too.
Yeah.
So it's kind of
Yeah.
I don't know, I just feel like.
Well, you guys got it. Like, we've got this really, like, as an aging population as well, like quality of care. So, like, to be really kind of blunt about it, we've got problems on both ends. And trouble in the middle, just with the typical population. So, with childcare, if my childcare counterparts were here, they'd be really quite clear that quality of childcare is often a problem for many of us as parents of young children. So what's true, unfortunately, it continues to be true for me as a parent, is the onus is on me to pay attention to whether or not it's effective or appropriate in relation to who my child is, and to make my decisions about that. And then, unfortunately, it becomes a little bit of a shopping exercise to try to find. Actually, my wife's lived the pain most like this, because now my son's 14. But we went through quite a significant period where we had a lot of difficulty finding good childcare for our son.
But at least you got to go shopping. You had choice. Yeah.
We went for a while with nothing, which was when you guys have lived the same thing, when you both have to work. It's quite challenging to kind of maneuver your way around that and just make it work for everybody that's involved. Now, when you talk about a child with a disability on top of it all, because we lived that quite a bit in our FSCD side, and you go through this period, and you guys have lived that as FMS administrators, you've got no one for any particular period of time, like that's distressing, right? That can be quite challenging, and I don't have a simple way to describe it.
But when you need childcare for someone that's 21, and that's what you are, because that individual, that your son, my son is still like a child, except he's 6 feet tall and 200 pounds.
Yeah.
But he needs the same level of care that he did at 6.
Yeah.
That's where the grandmas come in.
Well, actually, just to speak to this was said, but because that's I think that's in common for everyone, right? You go through phases of you've got good access or stronger points of support, maybe not everything you'd prefer, but stronger points, and then points when those supports are quite limited in their availability, those kinds of things. And that is part of our role, is to kind of help you with those changes as they kind of unfold for you. But at the same time, we don't have a lot of control over people, right, and their availability or lack of availability. And we can get into the whole wage discussion and resources and how that floats constantly in the background, because that does float constantly in the background. Because adult care is a form of care, whether you're children, whether you're youth, or you're adults. And there is kind of a standard in this whole thing called the wage matrix in Alberta. That is a constant form of challenge for all of us as Albertans, period. Because it does create a certain kind of ceiling in terms of availability. But having lived Alberta 55 years, the price of oil has an impact on availability. And so one of the things that kind of ebbs and flows around us that I've never seen us find a good solution to in Alberta is, as price of oil goes up and down, people come in, people leave, guess what? Our care systems go up and down. We went through a phase, was about 6 to 9 years ago, where price of oil was pretty decent. A lot of people were coming in, and they were hopping off of care jobs to move into other jobs because they paid more, whether it was $1 an hour or it was $2 an hour. So we had a lot of FSC families calling us and saying, and I'm sure in the FMS side, folks, if we've been connected at that time for one program, you follow the ebb and flow of the economy, you see these changes in availability. The other piece that I hear you guys kind of speaking to familiarly as well is just the quality of that support, right? What does that look like? How intentional is it? How targeted is it? Is it promoting the development of your child, youth, or adult in the way that you would hope and expect? Is it intentional? Is it an intentional interaction? And so, the idea is to kind of keep those conversations going, because where are those opportunities? Where can we strengthen some of that? And I know in FSC side, we've only found little pickets and pockets, and Beej, I'm gonna suggest you're a little up to date on some of the supports that we have going on in the youth world that address some of the gaps that Sabrina's kind of speaking to, but we know we're not addressing all the gaps. We know that families are leaving us for whatever the reasons might be, and sometimes it is legitimately, we don't have a support that fits with their circumstance. That's still going to be the case, that it come no matter how we kind of adjust to it. Yeah.
You know, I'm a lot older than all of you people in here. You have to be positive too. We've come a long way. We're working at it all the time, but we've come a long way. Because if you go back 50 years ago, if anybody had a handicapped child, I know a few cases where they were kept at home and kind of hidden away.
But now they're coming into care.
So, you know, we've come a long way. There's a long way to go, but
But we still have Michener.
what?
We still have Michener
Yeah.
in this
Yeah.
province.
Yeah, can't get rid of it. Okay, that's a pretty mixed deal, so I'm just not gonna go there yet. Because I hear two sides of a story on that all the time and every day. And just to pick up on a particular comment, because this does tie into some of the things that we're talking about, is as you follow from a life stage, are we adjusting with it? Are we adjusting with it? Because it's not just about government, sorry, because, I mean, part of my 55 years is living disability. And so a part of that is, you know, there was a comment just a moment ago, kids coming into care. FSC is a program. When I started, we were at 60-ish, well, it's 56, I remember the number, Mary Ann, 56. Kids, I think was my year one. We're at 62 right now. Our program's grown by 1,200 cases. So coming back to a positive, we hope it's a positive, is we kind of hope what that means is we're doing a much better job. Go back to my other slide about the child care thing that Fred pointed out. I hope that means we're doing a much better job of supporting families with the care of their child through those early stages so that they can be successful with their child in their home. We hit a peak of about 75 kids 3 years ago. And that number has just come down. And quite frankly, those children, and they're actually almost entirely all youth, very few are children under the age of 12. It's a really small number. And normally they're high needs to complex health. So I don't know if any of you know Rosecrest? Rosecrest? Yeah, so 9 of those kids are Rosecrest. So I know for some of you know what that means. So really pare it down to 52. I just looked at the kids the other day actually, and almost 50% of that what's left, 50 some, are really quite high needs kids with autism. And so that's about 25 or so more of those kids. The rest of those kids are the kids that Sabrina's kind of concerned about. They're the kinds of kids that may not have an intellectual disability, but they have other forms of disability that mean that the family's challenged with supporting their care in their home. And so we need to help them as best we can by having them live outside of their home. And some of those kids are pretty challenging. Wolfgang and I, it was about 2 years ago, because we'd been working on that together for a while, a few years. And so we knew a lot of shared cases, and we just looked at names. And it was actually, this is where FSC is so different from PDD, because a lot of kids had left out of home care and had either returned home. It was actually a really quite significant percentage, I don't remember the actual number, or were living in home-like settings, like host home or those kinds of scenarios. And actually, I'm quite connected with one of my cases in this past week that Wolfgang and I started out with almost 5-6 years ago. And that was that particular, well, he's an adult, actually really quickly here in the next 2 weeks. And that was his particular story, was the family stress, distress, not able to support his needs. He comes into group care, goes goes home for a time, family struggles with that, he goes to host home and he starts to do quite a bit better. He still has his challenges. If he was here today, he would still talk about his challenges and the things that are difficult for him. But, you know, for our involvement and what we kind of hope FSC would look like, it's kind of consistent with how we're designed, which is just to help for the time that the help is needed. And then hopefully things kind of shift and change over time. And either it's ongoing or it's, you know, for that time period that we're involved. And that has been one of our strengths or successes with many of our FSC families. What's interesting in PDD, which is different, and we don't have this quantified in any way, shape, or form, this is just simply observation, is PDD, to some degree, and my colleagues I think agree, has become more of a caretaker agency than it used to be. Once upon a time, in my time, which, you know, obviously is long, but not long enough, once upon a time, what we considered adult disability supports was similarly just involved for the time it needed to be. We had individuals who graduated from our supports. They came in for a time, got what they needed from us, and moved on. And those are some of the issues that we're trying to work our way through. And it's not just our business, like that's one of the core items that we wanted to just share, is just talking about Alberta supports, which is not really a program meant today, it's really an approach. And one of the things that we're trying to do, which is tied in with that pathways visual that I was sharing, is thinking about the same things that Sabrina was talking about with her son as an example, is if it's not us under PDD, then who else can help? And how can we do what we need to do to just help Jimmy, for sake of discussion, you're okay with that, Sabrina, is just Jimmy get the resources he needs to be as successful as we can hope. Because in my world, in the adult world still in particular, we had lots of individuals who just could not participate in the care as we thought it was in their best interest. We had best laid plans. We needed some participation in that. And, you know, we had our share of individuals. We had 120 cases. And probably at any given time, we had about 10 individuals out of that 120 who just didn't agree with us about what well-being looked like. So sometimes we had to do our part to try to help get to a point, but we might get to a decision point where we just had to agree that, you know, they weren't ready for a sport at that time. And that is a part of our work in that world of disability.
I just want to say something positive on the PDD side. Sometimes you even have an adequate funded contract and you have FMS staff, and I think in our case we have 7, and we use a Google Calendar to put requests out for when we need a time filled, like for this evening to go to this meeting. Well, of the 7 people, no one could do it, so of course he's at our home, but he's phoning constantly. And you know, I want to stay at the meeting, but I also have this feeling like I've got to go home because he's bored already. The football game is over on TV, and now he's got nothing to do. So.
What's the score?
I think it's Hamilton. I mean, Montreal.
Oh, the Montreal game.
Yeah. So, I mean, sometimes the funding is adequate, but you can't, sometimes just even if you have many staff, you still can't get what you need even when the funding is there. So you lose everywhere sometimes.
Yeah.
And a lot of the staff that we hire, like for my son especially, I mean, I'm not talking about everybody, they're not even qualified, they don't even know how to deal with him. They don't understand him, and so I have to teach them and train them, and by the time you realize it's too late, then, you know, either they move on or I have to let them go because they're more interested, they want to work their hours, their time, and it's not for the benefits of my son, you know, like, and we thank PDD, I mean, I'm thanking PDD for the help we get. Without PDD, I couldn't survive, so it's not that I'm criticizing anybody. I can just say that we need more people qualified in that field, and not everybody really likes that, to deal with that. Some even embarrassed, they don't think it's a high qualified job just to work with someone with a disability, which they should work with pride with them, and they have to get to understand the individual the way they are. If they treat them like a kid, or they take them from one world to another, I had to let go one step because that's all I was doing with my son for 7 hours a day, taking from one world to another. Well, what benefits, what is he learning? What are you doing with that? There is no other place, like there is no therapy or training jobs, some classes for training jobs. So that's the gap where it is. They don't know what to do with them.
Yeah.
And I can only coach so much, unless I do it myself. But then he doesn't want mom telling him what to do all the time.
Yeah.
They need
Yeah.
someone that understands them, and
Yeah.
not that they have to tell them what to do every minute of the day. Like,
Yeah.
we don't like that either, so
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
trying.
and for me,
It's
yeah.
very difficult.
Yeah.
You guys are doing a lot, and thank you for PDD, like I said.
Mhm.
And thank you for Gateway, like they do a lot of support and a lot of help. There's still not much for people that they're 35 and over or 30 and over or something like that.
Yeah.
There isn't, hopefully the new generation, they get to learn a little more, and the other people that accept them a little more, that they
Well,
will change in time.
Yeah, well, so quite frankly, folks, this is a great conversation for me. I hope it is for you, because I think I don't want to overstate this, but if it's unfair, but we kind of have a shared responsibility for something. And part of it is in FMS, for example, because if we had our agency service providers here and some of their families, would they say the same thing? I don't know. I genuinely don't know.
Yeah.
Because in Ethnicity, kind of the approach that we took, which is very FMS, like what Bobby's looking at. Sorry, did I just give something away?
Everyone's aware.
Whoops, I'm like, oh no, what did I go do? Through our service providers, they tried to create either activities or networks, right? And we often use that phrase, systems of support. And so where does it need to be created or structured in a way? Because FMS, just gonna be kind of blunt, shouldn't reinforce isolation, right? That's not one of the things it should contribute to.
That's what I said. I don't mean like PDD is going to find those things, but it's just the community itself. I'm not going to do with PDD. I'm just saying there isn't much out there for them.
Yeah, and I do think that that's one of the things that
I
they're
don't
embedding.
expect
Well,
PDD to find
the
a job for
gateway,
everybody.
right. Well, and some of that, quite frankly, we almost have to build together in some way, shape, or form, because like this is one of my best examples, because I see this at that individual level. There's a particular fella, again, males, what's up with males these days? They're a problem. We're needy or something. Anyway, a particular male that I can think of where really he's doing quite well. If you think about just independent living, he's doing a lot of things really well. But he has a lot of social skill problems when we talk about autism. And he just doesn't recognize when and where and what to say at the right time. So that constantly sets him up in terms of independent employment, just not be successful. So he's come to us for help. Now, the thing is, he needs someone kind of there, but he also needs a pretty compassionate employer. Just as a place of work, because you have to be patient, you gotta give him space. It's in the mental health world, I see commercials all the time these days about it, and actually there's a lot of onus on us who are in business or our employers to be compassionate about mental health. Well, in the world of disabilities, are we in the same place? I think that's part of what we're kind of saying, is that exactly, it's part of its workforce, but there also have to be opportunities and places to be where folks can feel not just safe, but supported, that it's comfortable. And then actually that staff part gets easier as well, because I'm just gonna speak to it from, if you're a caregivers sometimes when they're out and about in the community don't necessarily feel like they're particularly welcome. So they have to be kind of thick-skinned sometimes based on how the public and the general public kind of respond to them. And just what you're getting into, Philomena, like how we do a better job to just prepare them as a workforce to feel comfortable with what they're doing. There's this whole other high level thing that's been discussed over the last several years about how in North America, we're kind of sliding away from being a caregiver community. We're not valuing the caring for in quite the same way that we may have 10 years ago. So that's why sometimes when individuals are coming to us from other communities, other diverse communities, where that value is still really strong, like in Thailand, for example, if some of you read, I read. And that's one of the things that I was reading something about actually just not that long ago, is that there are certain cultures and communities where caring about and caring for is really, really highly valued. And, you know, well, how do we do that? How do we kind of engage folks in feeling a sense of value? Because in the human resources world, study after study says it's not always about how much you get paid, it's whether or not what you're doing means something to you. And there are a lot of jobs in a certain band of wage that are really quite comparable to each other. So would you rather work at a coffee shop or with one of our families, with their individual, and help them be a part of the community? And I don't doubt that there's something for us to think about with that. Gateway's a pretty strong participant in trying to address some of that inclusion of our autism society. And how do we better do that, right? So we can draw people in when they're young,
Yes,
in terms of
that's what
employment,
I'm saying. Like,
to be a part of that.
For my son, you know, like we're trying to do the best we can now, but I'm talking for the future generation.
Yeah.
We should start.
Well, I think we got to get it now too, as best we can.
Yeah,
I don't
but
disagree with you at all.
even the future generation, if we don't start now, like Gateway, if we don't start this 40 years ago,
Yeah.
so there wouldn't be out many people now. So
Yeah.
we need to look at the future too. I mean, we have to help now, but we need to help the future.
I'm thinking flexibility will be the key because I agree, it's gotta be the families plus the government. Like, I mean, nobody should download onto the government, vice versa. It's gotta be a group effort. But I'm thinking, you know, how flexible is funding from the government programs for maybe families to get together and hire somebody at a slightly higher wage so that they get more permanence, or create these social groupings.
Is anybody writing this down?
It's being taped. You can go
Okay,
back.
good.
I think there's some,
Transcription.
I think if there's more flexibility in allowing the families to sort of pool resources and find similar needs and allow that kind of that type of work to happen, I think we might see a little bit more some interesting results versus having a government provide a program which may not meet everybody's needs. But if families can pool resources, that would mean the government would have to, programs would have to be open to.
Let's do a quick poll sample, because we've got a plan to, anyway, about 20, just over 20. So that's kind of sort of representative. So exactly what Sabrina has just said. If there was flexibility in how you used your FMS funding to address sometimes what is a wage issue to hire quality caregivers.
Or accessing resources,
or
like a
accessing
community hall,
resources.
get four
Right.
young people together doing an actual project as
Right,
opposed to
so
an
you're
individual.
kind of entering into a little bit of a support agreement together, right, and shared planning, right, which if some of our other families, for like group living arrangements, some of our families have done that for group living, right? They get together under FMS and their adult kids share a home, right? But I think what Sabrina's getting at is something a little bit different, right? Is whether it's community access, what we call in our world, or something else, something a bit more intentional and focused, and you just pooling resources to do that. How many of you think that that would be meaningful to your the supports in your agreement?
It would save money as well, and
So about 60%, yeah, someone there. So this is kind of an interesting issue. Go ahead,
I was
Carmen.
going to say, we have started to actually have these discussions as individuals. We sit on a particular meeting that as the individuals are hitting that leaving school age, so 18, 19, and 20. One of the conversations we are starting to have is often when you're leading your FSCD, and where's the capacity to group individuals together, because sometimes the risk that I feel, and this is first, is that they've done so well in school being in groups, and then all of a sudden it's like we go to that respite, which a family needs, but when we get into that one-to-one thing, that's when we're getting the mall, and so how do we group them together? And we've actually started having those discussions on how do we do that better, because it makes sense, because we want to continue on that capacity and growth, right? A lot of our individuals have, like you said, they still have opportunity to learn, it's just at a different speed or level. And so how do we keep that momentum of school going into the early 20s and that? So those conversations are starting to happen.
And fill those 6 hours that are
Right.
all of a sudden free.
Right.
So you could hire one job coach, and maybe 2 or 3 people could share that job
Mhm.
coach, where they assist the support. I mean, obviously, you'd have to match people with similar needs.
Yes,
But,
yes.
but
Mhm.
still, they could maybe get out in the community and do something, either volunteer work or even swimming or whatever, but they're with their peers, a peer-like person with a support person, and not one-on-one.
It looks more like a friend,
one
an outing, yes,
versus
with
a
a
one-on-one.
group of people, right?
So there's actually versions of this happening. Sabrina. And this started through, if Jackie was here, but Center for Autism Services. And it wasn't about Center for Autism Services, it was about one of our parents who had gone from FSD now to PDD. And one of the things that she just took a lead on was organizing with some families, because they knew each other, a program, and I mean, it's called a program because that's sometimes how we think about it. We gotta give something a name, sometimes don't ask why. And she designed a program with involvement with a number of other families. And sometimes actually that's how our agency starts. Right? They start through a group of families who have a common need, and they come up with a plan and off they go. And some of our really, actually they're fairly small agencies, started out as FMS, individualized funded scenarios where families got together and they eventually became an agency. But exactly where you're going, Sabrina, the idea that and I think we've been playing with this as well through Bobby and Patty to some degree, is by just sharing information, really starting to have a really clear idea of what you're pursuing, talking about that together, and what does that look like. And that's stuff we can look at in the background, because one of the things that's shifted in the last few years for us as government is our agreements with you are really a grant, they're not a contract. I don't know how many of you are clear about that, but you've heard that language just recently. So, I was actually had to talk about it with Wolfgang around noon, because it's like, okay, I better be ready to explain this in case somebody asks me what the difference is. But in a contract.
Sorry, can I just back
Yeah.
up? Like,
Yeah.
'cause in our family situation, and I know there's a few other families, we actually have a broker.
Right.
And so that broker, part of their responsibility is hiring staff for our son and monitoring and,
Yeah.
you know, all the things that we do as parents, right? As an FA, I mean, I still retain
Yeah.
that sort of responsibility in that. But, you know, I mean, we've always thought, well, okay, you can have a broker for a couple of families, right?
Yeah.
And share resources that way in terms of, you know, staffing supports and that. I
Yeah.
mean, the cost is substantially lower for government as opposed to an agency, right?
Yeah.
And, but, you know, and I think that is a real viable option.
Yeah.
But yet, it's not, you know, shared among families. To be able to think in those terms of, you know, something much more specific for your son or your daughter or your nephew or your brother or whoever it
Yeah.
is, you know. Because an agency cannot address or meet, you know, the needs, right?
Yes.
They may offer a number of modules, and sometimes that individual might say, well, I want to do that module. Well, that module is full right now. You have to wait till 3 more modules go by before you can actually access it. And maybe it's not really something that person really wants to do. So by having, you know, like a broker and sharing staffing resources, you know,
Yeah.
2-3 families, and then also, you know, the benefit for staffing is that, you know, you get full-time staffing, right? So as opposed to some of the, you know, I might only need someone for, you know, 5 or 6 hours or whatever it is, but someone else might need that person 5 or 6 hours, right? And so you share those resources.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, I don't know, isn't it a viable option for government to look at or to offer families, you know, like, it's not for everybody.
Yeah.
And it's not for everybody, and it's not, you know, offered to everybody, right?
Yeah.
Because not everybody wants to do it. But not everybody wants to do FMS either.
Yeah.
Families are burnt out, you know, from what we've
Yeah.
heard. But that sometimes is the only viable option for them, because agencies, there's even no wait list. There's no spots available.
Yeah.
So what happens to those families? Those families, if they're, you know, in their late 40s, like kids have graduated or whatever, or 40s, or I shouldn't be saying specifically ages, but you're kind of like, this is my last push for intense work, right, before I retire. I gotta put in my last 10 or 15 or whatever years.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden that child graduates at 18, and you're left to do what? If there's no supports, well, guess who's doing it?
Yeah.
Like what you're talking about, your son at 14,
Yeah.
and at times not having
Yeah.
supports. It's same to a family of an 18, 19, 20-year-old.
Yeah.
Guess what? Every other week, you're gonna have to take a day off to stay home with your child. Because now we don't have anybody for that time.
Yeah.
Can I speak to that? Because that was actually suggested to me by my PDD worker when I was looking to access supports for him.
Many of them.
I described that my husband and I worked Monday to Friday, so we would need help with him Monday to Friday. And he said, ooh, yeah, that's gonna be tough. And now I'm panicking. I'm thinking, oh, okay, what can I do to make this come true? I don't want to be denied what I'm telling him. And I said, I can take a day off a week if need be. And he said, that might get us somewhere. So this is what I'm being told, that I need to not work, stay at home with my son so that I can get funding.
Well, then you might as well work and use that money to pay.
Exactly, that's what I'm thinking, is you want me to stay home, you want me to not go to work to pay my taxes, to stay at home with my son so that I don't have to ask as much money from the government? He said I would have better success if I showed a little give.
Okay. So.
Yes. And this is recently. This is recently, and I've asked for support, and I've been emailing. Has my respite support been okayed? And he's, oh yes, it sure has. And then later on that day or the next day, oh, I'm sorry, I actually forgot to ask for that.
Yes.
So now he has to reapply. So I wait 6 weeks. I send him another email. Has my respite support been approved? Yep, sure has. I have the emails. And he said, yep. I'm like, great, okay, where do we go from here now? To which he goes, oh, sorry, I thought you were another family. Yours hasn't been approved yet. So now, my son is graduating high school. I've pleaded with my daughter, who's about to move out because she's about to get married, please stay at home for another 2 months to buy me some time to get this sorted out. So now I'm paying her out of my pocket
So Sheila,
while I'm waiting on.
You were with us with FSC?
Yes.
And your son's 18 now?
He's actually turning 20 for the last 2 years because I felt that he was in high school still until this year.
Yeah.
Like we kept him in high school until he turns 20, which is in August. His socialization through school was great. He's living at home. We really didn't need. So I took no PDD supports for the last 2 years. Not one penny. Now that I've come to the PDD going, okay, now I'm ready for supports. I had the guy out in January thinking that's plenty of time to get the ball rolling as far as support services go. And then he was totally baffled as to how the Power of Work program through the Goodwill ran as well. He gave me misinformation on that as well.
So Sheila, maybe what I'm gonna ask you to do is just kind of, whether it's Carmen or Wolfgang, just give them your specific information so we can just kind of look at what's going on.
Yeah, because it's...
And try to figure that piece out, because that is trying to get general about it. We've been running into some real challenges with the shift from FSD to PDD, because in our PDD world, I'm just gonna call it what it is, we have a different perspective.
Yeah.
And one of the things we've been kind of pursuing through all this is it's like an FSD-like approach. Like when you talk about the routines of family life, and what might be normative versus what's driven by disability. So supervision, daytime hours.
Yeah.
You have to work Monday through Friday.
Yeah.
You've got a job, and you've got a responsibility to your employer, your income as a family, all those kinds of things.
And then also asking questions about what supports are available. How,
Right.
And again, we've already talked about this. How am I
Yeah.
going to keep him engaged in the community? How am I going to keep him a valued member of society? What programs are out there? And again, just not a lot.
Yeah.
I'm just curious with what she's talking about. Is it true, like 100%, that if your child is, because my girl is 19, they have to stay in high school? There's no chance of a program for PDD funding at all until they're at that age of 20, 21, where they can't go to high school anymore? Because even the school was telling me that PDD told them that if you're not already in a program, good luck finding something later.
I am PDD.
Yeah, this is what they told
And I'm
my
a senior
daughter's
manager
teachers.
in
Well,
disability
then
services
the
at
ones that
Missouri.
came to her school.
And that's not accurate.
That's
so-
why I want to
so-
be clear, because I'm thinking
Yeah.
that's,
Okay, so
Yeah.
one of the things that happens, sorry, just hang on a sec, is, and that's not unusual, is that maybe a message has been shared through whomever, one of our staff, or whatever it might be, and it was shared in a particular way, and now folks assume that that's the rule. There is no such rule. One of the things that we consider is whether or not there's a school program available to your individual. I'll just keep using Jimmy, sorry guys, just stick with that. For Jimmy, that would normally be available through the education school division, because not every school division continues on with Jimmy past 18.
well, my
Some
daughter's
of them.
starting her third year
Right.
of that same exact program. There's been no changes, nothing. I
Right.
feel like it's complete useless waste of their time.
Right, so I'll let Carmen and kind of Wolfgang jump in this a little bit, because they live it at a case level. I
Yeah.
don't live it as much as at a case
But
level. I
it
live
sounds
through
like you're
general
at the
stores.
end of that.
Yeah.
I'm just starting.
Yeah, so there's no finite rule about that, but the one thing we would think about is if a support is available, that your Jimmy would naturally be participating in. In our world and policy, we call that generic supports. It's something that's already out there. Then we don't automatically fund something equivalent. That's not a rule, it's a policy. So one of the things that would happen as Jimmy's parent is you come to us and we're talking with you about Jimmy, we go, oh, doesn't, I don't know, Elwood Cairns.
That's where she goes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, does that say
So
something
this
to
is
you?
the story.
That's what
Okay.
told me this whole
Right.
story.
Anyway, so I'll deal with the story I know, because it's a case I'm sort of involved with. And so I've got an 18-year-old male who turns 18 this month. And Elwood Cairns is prepared to provide him with a program in the fall and through the winter. That would help him with his pre-employment. And as best I know, all my parents, my history with them is they're a really patient school, and Edmonton Public is a really patient school division. If they think they can provide a support or a program that's appropriate to Jimmy, they will offer it. Now, you have the option to not participate, right? Just like that's Alberta education. Turn 16, you can choose not to go to school. That's the law. As parents, if you're planning that with Jimmy, we will have some conversations with you about that for sure, because our obligation is to not make the assumption that we need to fund a particular support or service. In fact, our obligation is actually explore whether or not there's something already in place that might meet that same need. Now, what ends up happening, of course, is you as a parent end up telling us why it's not either appropriate or sufficient or whatever it might be, and then we have to make a decision whether or not we're comfortable supporting an equivalent or alternative. But that's where we run into some trouble trying to figure that out on occasion.
Yeah, like her teachers told me that PDD informed them this year that if she's already not involved with some kind of program, that after her next year of school, good luck getting into something if we're not already involved with something.
So
that there's just nothing available.
Right. So yeah, and I mean, I'm pretty straightforward about things. The idea that there
I
are
just thought it was a strange comment.
well, that's a strange comment, but the piece is for our young families who are in that transitions phase, which is the two of you.
Yeah.
The idea that there are existing programs that are readily available, it's pretty tight. It's a little bit like my childcare example earlier said, is finding quality childcare right now in Edmonton is not the easiest thing to do if you're a family of young children. And so you have to shop and you have to work at it. Right now, when it comes to day programs or vocational programs, those kinds of things, a lot of our service providers are at their edge. And so that's one of the things coming back to what Oksana was talking about that I do think is a pretty darn plausible suggestion, is this idea of trying to form networks and look at how can some shared needs be addressed if you work through either brokers or, and I've watched some of our families, like I've only been with that adult side recently for this past year, but I've seen our adults come up with some, FMS families, come up with some pretty darn creative solutions when they start to team together and work on solutions. Yeah.
I'm going to ask the question about if there's any experiences that you've heard of in other regions that you would share with this group as far as similar experiences of sharing staff. Like I know they had a database going out of the Darryl Cook Center in Calgary. Is there any information that you have regarding that?
Nothing. Well, I mean, I can always ask, right? Because I think that's a really interesting question about where's Calgary at with the same thing. In terms of working through networks with families, because we're in quite different practices, we're in quite different worlds, like even the issue of a broker versus who is a programmer versus a program coordinator versus who is a team lead. Edmonton, Calgary, we have totally different operating definitions for that. So if Calgary happens to have something on the go, that is, you're hearing about it, that seems to fit with some of the same things that some of these same families are talking about, we can make that query. But I don't know that much about it. I'm 1 year into the PDD side. If you ask me about FSC, I can tell you quite a bit about what's going on in Calgary versus Central versus Brantford versus Fort Mac. Yeah, adult side, I've spent some good quality time with my adult colleagues, but the idea that they're ahead of us on something, I literally would just have to ask them. Like, here's a need that some of our families were discussing. Where are you at with that in terms of how you support that? Do you have any particular suggestions for us in terms of something that you've seen be successful? Like one of the things that, so I'm just going to come back to this for a second, is this I'm just going to highlight it, what I heard, because maybe you heard it wrong, is in FMS, one of the things that's not an uncommon experience is a degree of isolation in trying to meet needs, right? Just get caregivers in place consistently. And so one of the things that I'm also hearing is that, through brokers, which isn't, this is one of the things that it's just my observation, and Carmen, you can just correct me if I'm wrong here, is I still see families in our FMS world each trying to solve their own problems, as opposed to this whole thing that we just talked about, that if we just kind of networked a little bit more.
Yeah, but I use the analogy that, so our regular kids, they're on the soccer field,
yeah,
and we're there as community. We come from different schools, maybe different neighborhoods within that community,
yeah.
But all of kids play soccer, right?
Yeah.
But our families who have someone with a disability, we're like in silos. Where do we come together? We don't have a field, a playing field to come together on.
Yeah. Yeah, and unless you
So
network.
how do we?
Well,
yes, but
I'm not trying to oversimplify. Yeah.
For us to do that,
Yeah.
and a supportive space to do that.
Yeah.
And we haven't been supported in education, so.
Don't get us started.
Yeah, but
You
sorry,
know.
I'm gonna, I'm just kinda curious about what you're wanting to jump in on, because I don't have a finance solution to very much, because geographically where you reside at families, I don't know, because I know our FMS families are all over our Edmonton region. But I know ACT Center came from a place, or a reason, and not everybody's comfortable with ACT. I was around for the beginning of ACT, and it came from the same place of folks wanting a safe place for their children, youth, and adults to be.
On a devalued piece of property.
But, okay.
Sorry.
So from your perspective, and Oksana, I'm fine with being pushed as long as you're fine with being pushed. Because I've spent a lot of time there with families, with youth, with children and adults. And what I look for, are they happy? And my experience with them is they enjoyed themselves while I was in that experience with them. And if that's a devalued piece of property, because I've actually, believe it or not, spent a fair bit of time in that Brew Valley, in that location. And I'm okay with it when I'm with a person with a disability that I know. Other families are not, and I totally respect and appreciate that. But then the alternative looks like what? Right? No, Oksana, go
I
ahead.
know, hey, I mean, and you know, our son wants to go there, and he goes there, but he also is a valued member because he has gainful employment. So for us, it's balancing it, you know, so that is available, and do we want him necessarily? Well, he does, so, you know, we let him make that choice, but he also is valued in other places in his community. Meaningful, and not, like, it's not just about being happy.
And,
Well,
okay, and ACT, which is a wonderful place, but they, you know, you have adults going there, and their programs end in June. Our adults aren't, they don't end in June. They don't end in June. They know they're adults, they're going to work, they maybe get 2 weeks vacation if they're lucky. But why is the program for ACT end in June? And like Rock and Rundle and all those wonderful things where there's, you know, maybe 100 people with disability services. And when you go for a broker, you go to PDD and you ask for a broker. First of all, when you go to PDD every year to renew your contract, it's a confrontation, and it's like being in a fight. You know, I want this much money. No, you only need this much money. So they're starting at $900, and you're like at $3,000, or they're at $473, which is, you know, for support living, and then they want the paperwork. You know, what do you mean he has a behavior? Where's your paperwork showing all his behavior? He's an adult. I don't know, like, the family managed. We don't have staff writing out paperwork and programs.
Yeah. So, so I'm just going to go back to Oksana for just a second, because with this piece, I'm not quite sure. Maybe I'm just not hearing you really clearly. Because the piece is still about what actually works, and then I don't have another word for it, what's working best for your son or your daughter or whatever, based on what you would hope for, right? Because it's not, you know, when I use that word happiness, I don't mean that you just got a smile on your face or whatever. I don't mean that in a, you know, in an affect way. I mean, you seem to be enjoying it, you want to go, you want to be part of it, and you just talked about that as well, Roxanne, for your, is it son? But you also want to see him involved in other things and part of other things, right? And so that's the beauty of FMS in some respects, is you get to make those plans very individual. You get to really create a system of supports that really create a, well, just very individualized, right, to who your son or your daughter might be.
And I agree with you, because not everybody is the same, not everybody wants the same thing.
Yeah.
Like my son, he goes to Special Olympics. He goes, but he doesn't have anybody there. He wants to be inclusive with the other. Then we had a broker, the first broker, and she went to play with them bowling with them regularly, and it's the 4th year, and he's still going, and actually this year he's doing quite well, and they came 4th, even got $220, but he wants to be with everybody so-called normal, because nobody's, I'm normal, but I'm just saying he wants to be with the rest of the population. He
Yeah.
doesn't like to be.
Congregated.
He already spent all his
Yeah.
school years segregated with
Yeah.
all kinds of special needs. So he wants to be with the rest of the world, with the other people out there.
Yeah.
So we have to find, we did find, it's a meetup group. They go every Thursday night for a walk, and it's all inclusive. I mean, the staff has to go with them, you know, and that's, we can really for that, because I couldn't walk that much, you know, with them, you know, the way they walk. So, but everybody's individual.
Yeah.
And that's why a broker, like she said, it worked good, because then you can ask the broker exactly what to look for your son. But although they look and look, it's hard to find things. That's not your background, it's community itself. So
Yeah, and I think that that's one
you
thing.
can solve that
Yeah.
problem.
Well, but I think we can try to pull other folks into these conversations, which is what like Alberta Sports is really about doing social services, right? Like our kind of work folks. But it's not like City of Edmonton or other folks aren't seeing Alberta, seeing Alberta are interested in these same kinds of things. If we just find the relationship with the ACT Center, the idea under the City of Edmonton that their programming is relative needs of adults. Does anybody know anybody to creating those opportunities? So sometimes we run into the other side of that,